You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. As always, I am still your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson. Thanks for being here once again this week, and this is a good one. David Patrick Harry is back on the show, but before we get to David Patrick Harry, another guest I can tell you about is going to be the guest for our monthly Zoom call. And the way to get on this Zoom call is to go to patreon.com/counterflow and become a donor to the show for $5 a month or more. Once a month, we will be doing these Zoom calls. It's not recorded. They won't be on YouTube. They won't be anywhere because once the Zoom call is over, it's done. So we can say whatever we want in the privacy of our own little Zoom room. Boy, that sounds so 2023, but it is what it is. This month, the call will happen on, let me look here, February 23rd at 7 p.m. Central Time. Special guest will be friend of mine, friend of the show, Vin Armani, aka Cyprian, where we will be discussing the demonic nature of AI and technologies in general, and possibly transhumanism. We will get into that kind of stuff. It's an open format, right? Vin and myself will be talking, and you guys can ask questions, do the hand raise thing whenever you feel like it throughout the session. I think you're going to get a lot out of this monthly Zoom call, especially this one. It's going to be good. So, like I said, $5 a month over at patreon.com/counterflow, and you can get in this call. So, back to my guest today, David Patrick Harry. He's been on before. A lot of y'all are familiar with him from his Church of the Eternal Logos channel. Today, we're discussing mushrooms, LSD, hallucinogens, and as we call them, psychedelics, I should say. I think it's more accurate to say psychedelics, spirituality, trips, Christianity, all of these things tied in to one big discussion. Do people see things on mushrooms that aren't really there? Is it just some chemical reaction in their brain, or is it a spiritual experience? Can bad spiritual experiences happen when you're on psychedelics? Can good ones? Can they put you on a bad path, seemingly like in a trip you can't get out of? We're talking about all of these things today. And I think for those of you who are aware of the work that David Patrick Harry has done, you know he's kind of the go-to guy on this topic. He's a Ph.D. student at the Graduate Theological Union, where his research focuses on the new religious movements and trends within America. In addition to that, he's done research into the occult, the New Age, the psychedelic spirituality, and of course, he's an Orthodox Christian. So he knows all of these things, and he's going to tie it into one wonderful discussion with us, and he's back on the show. My brother, David Patrick Harry. How are you, sir?
Hey, what's going on, man? How you been?
I'm pretty good, ups and downs, but I certainly can't complain. And I want to let you introduce yourself. I know you've been on before, but I always get new listeners, and a lot of people, of course, I know there's some crossover, so they're going to know you already, but specifically because we are going to talk about psychedelics and spirituality and orthodoxy and kind of some crossover, and then some maybe not so good things about psychedelics. Include that in your background, because I want people to understand why you're here, because you're kind of the guy to come to on these type of things. So go ahead.
Yeah. So now I run a YouTube channel called Church of the Eternal Logos, and I'm a PhD student working on my dissertation at the Graduate Theological Union, where my research focuses what's kind of housed in what's called the new religious movements and the Western esoteric traditions. And I look at technology, and most specifically what I call, like what people know as transhumanism, or I would say technologies of transcendence, the religion of technology, spirituality of technology. And I try to trace this throughout the history of spiritual ideas, magic, and stuff like that. But before I became Orthodox and started, this whole YouTube channel, I had a previous YouTube channel called Fractal Universe. And it was basically a apologetics for psychedelics. And so during my undergraduate, I spent 2 summers in China. I was studying religious studies, biology, double major. and was really interested in stuff like from Alan Watts, Terence McKenna, Timothy Leary, Robert Anton Wilson, and started to get into taking LSD, mushrooms, smoking DMT. And at that time, I believe this was sort of the leading edge of what we would call the religious experience, and that I kind of bought into perennialism, that all religions sort of lead to the same mountaintop, so to speak. And I thought, well, really, if people want to become spiritual, psychedelics are the way to go. This is how you move into this sort of non-physical, non-local realm of spirit, of altered consciousness. And I created that YouTube channel during my master's program at the University of Illinois, where I focused on early Christianity, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and then psychedelic shamanism. And so I did that for basically 5 years. And it was during my Ph.D. program where I was doing research on a book, this one right here, called The Psychedelic Gospels, which really is analyzing instances of psychedelic frescoes in southern France, southern Germany, northern Italy, Turkey. And it's been speculated, such as a scholar named John Marco Allegro, who worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls, that Jesus Christ was actually a mushroom. And this is due to one of his books, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. Well, at that time, again, I was a non-believing Christian. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. I'm already familiar with John Marco Allegro's work. I'm already familiar with basically all the various traditions that participate in inebriating substances. And I was familiar with R. Gordon Wasson and his wife, Valentina Pavlovna, a Russian, who wrote a book called Russia, Mushrooms, and History. And in there, they analyze the linguistics between Slavonic languages and French, Germanic languages, English, and look at what they described as mushroom phobic and mushroom philic cultures. And so in Slavic cultures, for example, it's totally common for a grandmother to take young girls out into the forest and pick up different mushrooms. You cook these mushrooms with this type of cuisine, these mushrooms for this. And so they have tons of words for different types of mushrooms. It's part of their culture. And so at that time, again, promoting psychedelics, working on my PhD at the time, I was familiar with this work. And so based on the frescoes, I said, okay, well, this is a historically contextualized phenomenon. All these frescoes in France, Germany, Italy, and Turkey, they all exist between the periods of the 900s to the 1300s. And so there's about a 400-year period where they all emerge from. And that coincides with a Gnostic heresy called Catharism, that emerged in that same place. And that's influenced by the Bogomils of Bulgaria, the Paulicians of Armenia. And I thought, oh, I bet if I can find these mushroom frescoes in Western Christianity because of the Slavonic affiliation with mushroom picking, I bet if I go learn about Eastern Orthodoxy, I can find it in the icons because, at that time, again, being a non-Christian, I knew that iconography was essential to the Eastern form of Christianity. So I thought, oh, once I figure all that stuff out, then I can start analyzing all their icons, and I'll bet I'll find more mushrooms. And that led me to taking a course on the history and theology of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And that kind of ingratiated me to what I call logos theology, and how the logos, the second person of the Trinity, but also this concept that was developed by Plato, Heraclitus beginning, but Plato and Aristotle and Stoicism and Neoplatonism all talked about this logos. And so it was essential to Greek philosophy. And learning how the Eastern Orthodox have incorporated that Greek concept and how it's understood in their theology, which is different than Western Christianity. I was non-believing. I didn't find all the mushrooms I was looking for, but I was like, that's pretty interesting. So I think that was in the spring of 2018, I took that class. And so basically by the fall, I was still, supporting and promoting psychedelics. And I actually did an LSD experience. And it was an experience in which it kind of connected all these dots. So all these things that I thought I liked about the New Age, being spiritual, not religious, occultism, esoteric traditions. I took this LSD and I did it typically. I didn't do like party scenes or stuff like that. I like to just do it by myself for, spiritual purposes, if you will. And for me, it was just like a download of how really what I liked about all that stuff Orthodox Christianity and its understanding of the Logos already talked about it. So, for example, we're all one. This is a common euphemism for people that take psychedelics. Well, Christianity says love your neighbor as yourself. Similar concept, but not the same thing because we're not all the same self. And so Christianity is saying we're all different selves, but you need to love each other as the same self. Whereas psychedelics saying, oh no, we're all the same. Really, there's only just one cosmic consciousness. I was thinking about sacred geometry. I love sacred geometry. I love fractals and all this type of again, a spiritual understanding of the patterns of reality. Well, where is all that rooted? As a psychedelic psychonaut, I didn't have a metaphysics to even root these things to be like really existent. Like, okay, yeah, I love sacred geometry. I love fractals and patterns, but archetypes, but where do they exist? And it was like, well, they have to exist in the Logos. And that's what Plato's talking about. If you read Platonic philosophy, he's talking about all the archetypes are rooted in the Logos. And so whether you're talking about Jungian psychology, it's still the Logos that houses all these archetypes. And so I was thinking about archetypes and fractals and sacred geometry and objective morality and objective truth and the idea that we're going to be divinized. This is a huge a dimension of orthodoxy that is not found in Western Christianity. It's called theosis. And so the point of the incarnation of God as man is so men can become and participate in God. And of course, when you take psychedelics or you're interested in occultism, the whole thing is about self-divinization. And so it just like kind of reformed the way I looked at everything. And I was like, geez, I think that, this orthodoxy thing makes a whole lot more sense than everything that I've really been promoting. And so that led to, on November 11th of 2018, I got down and prayed and I, gave my life to Christ, so to speak, but I wasn't Orthodox. I just knew a ton about Orthodox theology and was reading the church fathers. I was reading this book right here was the first one that really began to shape my worldview on the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ by St. Maximus the Confessor, where he's talking about the Logos and the Logi, and how all these archetypes, whether it be a chair, whether it be the father archetype, whatever it is, these are Logis rooted back in the Logos. And see him articulating this, and that's coming from like the 8th century. It's like, geez, that is so profound. And so eventually, it led to I kind of stopped doing psychedelics, and then my life, things started to fall apart a little bit. I kept getting more and more interested in orthodoxy. I started going to liturgies. And at the time, my girlfriend wasn't as interested in that stuff. And it was kind of causing problems. And eventually, I feel like I had to break up with her. We couldn't keep doing what we were doing. And at the same time, I was in Berkeley, California. And so my whole worldview was transitioning. This is during the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, the Donald Trump phenomenon. Trump gets elected in 2016, Jordan Peterson blows up in 2017. And now it's 2018, moving into 2019. And I can see my politics, my worldview, everything's becoming more conservative. And it led to my final psychedelic experience, if you will, where I went to an ayahuasca ceremony and got loaded on the ayahuasca, took as much as the shaman would give me. And I had a prayer that I actually wrote down. Again, not me and another buddy were probably only adjacent Christians there. Again, I was not Orthodox at the time, but I was reading so much about Orthodoxy, and I was even going to liturgies. And I just prayed to God to like show me what I'm supposed to do with my life, because I'm in Berkeley, California, and this whole dream that I had to be a professor, to wear my tweed jacket and have my briefcase and tell the kids to come into my office hours. I was realizing I can't do it. Like this system is not going to allow me to be the person that I thought I was going to be. So the undergraduate, the master's, the Ph.D, all of this education, I realized, I felt like I was stuck. I felt like I just built my whole life and I came to a cul-de-sac and I thought it was going to lead to this journey. And I was like, oh my God. And so I didn't really know what to do with my life. And I hated producing all the psychedelic stuff at that point. It felt like a burden as opposed to this thing where I felt evangelical about it. Mm-hmm. And so I did this ayahuasca ceremony, and what I experienced was, again, this realization that the Logos, Christ, is the standard of which we'll all be judged on. And that it was time for me to become a builder, just like Christ. He was a carpenter, and it was time for me to build instead of consume drugs, consume the ideas of other people, consume culture. And it felt like the message was I needed to create and really move forward with this new YouTube channel called Church of the Eternal Logos and promote Logos theology and orthodoxy. And the psychedelics stopped working. So I was taking ayahuasca. Some people may be familiar with all that stuff. And once I got that message that it was time for me to build, it's like the drugs just stopped. All the visions, all the aesthetics, all the colors with my eyes closed, everything just went black. And I still was taking more and asked the shaman, it didn't work anymore. And to me, that was my last psychedelic experience. And that was the beginning of really the journey that then people who are probably familiar with your content, my content, everything that they've seen from that point forward began after that. And so all the videos, all the streams, it was basically me taking my entire life of studying world religions and psychedelics and esotericism, and then becoming a Orthodox Christian and kind of putting all that stuff to the side and then for trying to promote how to look at the world through this prism of Logos theology. And so long intro there, but that's exactly then my relationship to psychedelics and what it is that I do now.
For those who are kind of maybe outside of our circles or looking at things through more of a secular lens, can you quickly explain? A lot of people don't understand that term logos. They'll hear you say it and it's like, well, that part goes over my head, but I'll grasp on what else he's talking about. What does logos mean?
So logos it's a Greek word, and it was common in Greek philosophy. And the first time it really gets written down is by a gentleman named Heraclitus. And Heraclitus is famous for his sort of arguments with Parmenides on the nature of being, on really ontological philosophy. So Heraclitus is famous for saying you never step in the same river twice. And he believed that everything was in flux, everything was changing. And the only thing that really wasn't changing was the logos. Now, Parmenides said he believed in a sort of non-changing world. And this is why they were debating back and forth. But Heraclitus really popularized this concept of logos, because for him, everything's changing. And the logos is the thing that unifies opposites. And so that's why in the word logic, which again comes from the Greek, is rooted in the word logos, because the logos for him was the source of logic. It was the source of numbers. It was the source of reason. It was the source of language. And so we're talking, 500 BC, late 400 BC. This is Heraclitus. Well, this concept becomes really embedded within Greek philosophy. And we can see somebody like Plato, again, talking about the logos. Now, the logos for him would be what we would call a demiurge. So Plato believed in a sort of ultimate good. We would consider it a god, but it's not a personal god. It's sort of an abstraction. It's the ultimate good. And the first creation, the first emanation of the good is the logos. And the logos is where all the forms, so Platonic forms, all these forms, all these archetypes, all these universal structures are housed in the logos. And so, for example, a chair, there's all types of chairs. We know what a chair is. But the concept of a chair, where does that exist? Plato would say it's a priori exists in the logos, and that is more real than a chair that I'm actually sitting on. And this became a debate within Greek philosophy. Which one is more real? The chair I'm sitting on right now, or the non-physical concept, the archetype of the chair that only exists in the mind because we can participate in this logos thing, this abstract realm that houses all these things we can't touch. And for Plato, he believed those things were more real. And so for Platonic philosophy, it begins with the logos, it begins with these forms, and then what we would call deduction, he deduces down to the way the world is. His student Aristotle began in the totally opposite direction. Mm-hmm. So he said, okay, well, I'm going to begin my philosophical inquiry, my pursuit, my epistemic pursuit for knowledge and truth. I'm going to say, actually, what's more real is what we can feel and touch. And so he began with induction. What can we observe on the world? And then I'll deduce things to there. So Plato begins up here and comes down. Aristotle begins on what we can observe and then goes up, basically. These are real, again, simplistic formations, but generally this would be the difference between their philosophies. And so you can see things like Stoicism. One of the Roman philosophical systems believed in the logos. So they said, you know what? Plato, Aristotle, we hear what you're saying. And for Aristotle, the logos was correct reason, correct logic, correct speech. And so it wasn't so much this big metaphysical thing, although Aristotle probably to some degree would accept aspects of that, but it was more a practical understanding of how we get into logic and rational speech and all this stuff. So the Stoics, they believe that there is a logos, again, a sort of demiurgic logos, but the logos is the order of nature itself. And so for the Stoics, Stoicism is often characterized by the rejection of hedonistic pleasure. And so Stoics are not interested in pleasure whatsoever. They're interested in Stoicism. The highest thing is to accord one's morality with the structure of nature. And so one of the basic tenets of Stoic philosophy is to accord one's behavior with this objective structure called the logos, which is then the basic metaphysical basis of nature itself. And so this concept of logos gets blended with the Hebraic prophetic tradition. So Israel isn't doing philosophy. They're a group of people that God has made a covenant with, and he's slowly revealing himself through space and time, and eternal beings revealing himself through space and time to then demonstrate that I'm going to incarnate as a man, and I'm going to fulfill all these prophecies to demonstrate that I am God. And in the Gospel of John, then, what we see is the unification of these two different historical strands of thought coming together to say both these groups of people are actually talking about the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so in the Gospel of John, it says, in arche in ho logos in the Greek. In the beginning, in English, we say, is the word. In the beginning was the logos was with God, and the logos was God. And so this is a total, again, for the Jews, for the Hebrews, this is a philosophical framing that they did not have. And for the Greeks, this is a theological framing that then elevates this logos, not to something created, but something uncreated. It's actually the same essence as the Godhead itself. And this then set a total new trajectory for the Western mind, Western civilization. So once the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, it basically only did theology for 1,000 years. And it isn't until the Western branch of Christianity, what would become the Catholic Church due to the Great Schism, developed scholasticism. And scholasticism really began to move into this Aristotelian approach where we can just observe nature. And again, at that point, it wasn't until the Renaissance that the Latin West had Plato. So they didn't have access to the Platonic dialogues, but they had Aristotle. And so Aristotle was the preeminent philosopher. And so his philosophical position of beginning with what we can observe led to what we would call natural theology, which leads into natural philosophy, which leads into no longer presupposing God to make truth claims. And so this was a tension between Bonaventure and again, other scholastics like Thomas Aquinas. Bonaventure, whoa, guys, we can't just like observe nature and come to truth claims without first presupposing God. And they're like, no, yeah, we can. And so this leads into the philosophical enterprise itself that is like, we're going to come to truth claims by just observing the world. And this was a break between just a presuppositional break between East and West. And so the Logos is the second person of the Holy Trinity for all Christians. Anybody who is a Bible-believing Christian, so that's true for Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox. How we relate and participate in the reality of the Logos is different between these traditions. And so, yeah, to sum up then what this Logos is, it is this Greek philosophical concept. It's a Greek word. The New Testament, the Gospel of John is saying everything that these Greeks have been talking about and everything that these Hebrews have been talking about as the Messiah has actually the same thing. And so the Logos incarnated as Jesus of Nazareth, creating Jesus, it is Jesus Christ. And I don't want to say created. He isn't created. He is uncreated. But his human nature, getting that from Mary, we now have the full bringing together in one person, divine nature, human nature. And this is essential for us being able to bridge into that non-local realm. if the logos is the place for all the archetypes, it's for all the truth. Well, then when you read Christ saying, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, I am the light, now you can understand, oh, he is the metaphysical structure that all these things can exist from. And because he became man, we can then bridge into that. And if he never became man, how exactly do we fully participate in that reality? And so that's another, long-winded explanation, but that is what we mean by logos, is the second person of the Trinity. And it's a sort of synthesis of these two worldviews.
That was beautiful. You just connected a lot of dots for a lot of people that didn't previously have them connected. So that was wonderful. That's one of the best explanations I've ever heard on it. So let's get to the psychedelic part. Broadly, really quick, obviously we're talking about mushrooms and LSD. Is ayahuasca considered psychedelic?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So ayahuasca is basically a liquid form of dimethyltryptamine, DMT. Mm-hmm. And so generally the consensus that DMT is the most powerful of the psychedelic substances.
Okay. The
tryptamine molecules themselves. So tryptamine would be psilocybin, all the various psilocybin mushrooms, ayahuasca, and then DMT. And then LSD is sort of an ergot derivative, but it works very similar to these tryptamine molecules. And so the ayahuasca then is the synthesis of two plants in the Amazon. One which is an MAO inhibitor, and so it inhibits the enzymatic breakdown of the dimethyltryptamine. Because if you just put a bunch of DMT in your mouth, your body's going to naturally break it down, and so you're not really going to have this euphoric experience. That's why you have to smoke DMT, and it lasts for about 10 minutes, maybe if you did a lot, 12 to 15 minutes. But it's a really brief experience because the body can break it down so well, because the tryptamine molecule is so similar to other dopamine molecules like serotonin and stuff. So the brain knows how to break this thing down really quickly. Ayahuasca, these various tribes in the Amazon, and this is a mystery, nobody knows how, they found two plants that are totally in different places of the jungle, that if they mixed them at a certain ratio, the MAOI inhibitor, it can basically inhibit the breakdown of the dimethyltryptamine, and therefore they can get into these altered states for a prolonged period of time, an hour to 4 hours long, and therefore they can maneuver through this space. And so that's where then shaman ayahuasca, or what we call ayahuasqueros, or the ayahuasca cults of the Amazon, have these shamans, and that's the job of the shaman for the tribe. Is many of them will do collective ceremonies where they'll all get inebriated on the ayahuasca, but the shaman himself, his job is to move into that realm where that, again, the ayahuasca allows you to be in for a long period of time, to deal with spirits, figure out how he can control spirits, bring spirits under his sort of power. And that's the whole basis of the sort of shamanic role within these ayahuasca cults, is to go into these altered experiences, figure out where the game is, where are we going to hunt at, where are the animals, what happened to your grandmother that died. And the goal is that the shaman goes into this altered state, and then he can receive answers to all these questions because it's a non-local realm. So in a way, they believe it's outside space and time. And so he can take his awareness, his consciousness, go into a place that's outside space and time, and he can retrieve answers for things. And so, again, long story short, ayahuasca is definitely a psychedelic, and it is related to the most powerful psychedelic, but because they have an MAO inhibitor, they can be in that state for a much longer period of time.
Okay. So broadly, when we say psychedelics, we can say we're talking mushrooms, at LSD to an extent, ayahuasca, DMT, those things of that nature.
Those are tryptamines. And then it would also include then things like Amanita muscaria mushrooms, the red and white mushroom, which is not a tryptamine molecule. You can look at then ergot. You can look at, so ergot's it's a fungus like that grows on corn, like corn smut. And so it's believed that this is the basis of the Eleusinian mysteries, that they learned how to break down the ergot from their barley. They would grow this fungus, and then they could figure out how to get the inebriating alkaloids out of there along with the toxins, separate those, and then they would drink these beverages, and that's how the Greek mysteries were revealed. And it was all based on the celebration of Persephone, and Persephone in Greek mythology goes to the underworld and then comes back. And so it's like this death and rebirth experience. And so they revealed the Greek mysteries, and this was huge for Greek culture. So Plato, Socrates, all these people probably participated in this. And it was the way in which they revealed the mystery of this sort of the Greek religion to different things. It was a mystery cult. And so then you can look at things like cacti and mescaline. This is another psychedelic, but these aren't tryptamine. So these are a little bit different, and the body breaks them down differently.
Right.
The tryptamines are unique in that they mimic brain chemistry so similarly. They're just a little bit different than again serotonin, neurotransmitters that we already have in our brain. So again, and so the tryptamines, then that would be where we see LSD's not a tryptamine, but it's kind of similar. But the psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT, these are in fact tryptamines. And so
is that why they call it a trip? Because of that? Is it short for that?
No, I don't think that's. They called it a trip because it feels like you go on a journey. Yeah. And by the time you get done, it seems like a lot of time has passed comparatively to what actually happened.
Yes. Right.
But maybe they called the tryptamine based on them causing trips. I'm not sure how exactly it got its etymology. I'd have to look into that. I'm not sure.
Finally, I found something to stump David Patrick Harry. One, that's not easy to do. So there's people that will be listening to this that have never experimented in psychedelics of any sort, that will hear the people that do it often and think they just sound kind of like hippies or goofballs saying like, oh man, I went on this spiritual journey, bro. And a lot of people will equate that to, no, you had a plant version of, let's say, whiskey or some wine. Whereas people that drink think they're in this, euphoric high for a second, and you just did a mushroom. And it's the same thing. It altered your brain chemicals to make you think that. From an Orthodox perspective, and certainly with the perspective of your Orthodox worldview with this background that you have, is it an actual spiritual experience that one can have on, let's say, mushrooms?
Yeah, I would say it's quite different than alcohol. So alcohol is a depressant, and these psychedelics are not depressants. They don't slow down your system, they speed it up. Now, it's not the same thing as speed or amphetamines, but the phenomenological experience of psychedelics is a totally different ballgame. And that's where in English, we really just have a terrible category we call drugs.
Yes.
And unfortunately, it's just so unsophisticated that we group all these things together and we think they're all the same thing. And somehow alcohol sort of stands outside of this category called drugs, but they're all mind-altering substances, including caffeine, which, I'm drinking my natural caffeine right here. Mm-hmm. But the psychedelics are a totally different ballgame. And so psychedelic was a term developed by Humphrey Osmond, a psychologist, that means mind manifesting. And so this went back to Aldous Huxley and some of these early experiments in the 40s and 50s where, Huxley, in the Opening the Doors of Perception, he describes his experiences using LSD and mescaline together. Albert Hofmann, the guy who synthesized LSD, he did that in the late 1930s. But it really wasn't until the later 1940s where this substance really became popular. And so Aldous Huxley argued that these substances cleanse the doors of perception, referencing William Blake and the idea that if the mind was pure, we would realize the infinity of the world itself, basically. And so these psychedelics then cleanse our perceptions. And this set forth then a new trajectory, and they really got going then when Timothy Leary, who was a Harvard psychologist at that point, took some mushrooms in Mexico. This is like 1959. And so by 1960, Harvard gave him the go-ahead, him and a handful of other psychologists, to start performing experiments there at Harvard for 3 years, looking at LSD and psilocybin mushrooms. And this set a whole trajectory in psychology. Now, in 1964, they become banned. So these substances were legal. And if you're in San Francisco, you could go to a head shop and you could buy cannabis, you could buy LSD, you could buy mushrooms right there at the shop, downtown San Francisco. But in 1964, with the Drug Act, the federal government made all these things illegal. And that really was the impetus for the countercultural revolution, because it was revolting against the idea that the hegemony was the Christian hegemony, Protestant Christian hegemony was going to suppress all these things, which were opening them up to new levels of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And so psychedelics are not the same thing as alcohol, because one, as Orthodox, all these substances can lead to a sort of spiritual possession. And that's why inebriation, generally speaking, is something to be very, very careful with. But psychedelics specifically are so radical in their altering of one's perception and experience that they can open you up to that spiritual world much more so than other substances, even much more so than cannabis, even though cannabis could be another gateway. Alcohol is certainly a gateway. People become addicted to alcohol, and anybody then who becomes an obsessive drinker, you can see, nefarious behavioral patterns emerge that we would say are leaning into a sort of spiritual possession. Not that they're possessed in like the Exorcist sense of the movie or the Hollywood movie. It's
Right.
that's a rare case. But any form of sin is a minor temptation which leads the image of God to sort of dissipate within us. And so that's really what the whole possession is. It's how much of the image of God is in us. And so these psychedelics can open you up to a reality in which you can, in fact, be possessed. And you're opening yourself up where you can't defend yourself in those altered states to the same degree. Now, does everybody who takes psychedelics become possessed? No, of course not. That'd be a ridiculous thing to say. Does everybody who takes psychedelics have, demonic experiences? No, not necessarily. I know there's been a handful of people in the orthosphere who had a psychedelic experience, and basically they had a revelation of Christ, and then they stopped doing all that stuff. And myself included, and I know many others, and I'll let them speak of that. I'm not going to include anybody, in what they did or didn't do, but Christ, God can meet you anywhere. And so if you're obsessed with these drugs, God needed to meet me in that altered state of psychedelics because I was so embedded into them. But yeah, we can get into my own experiences or seeing people who were potentially possessed to one point, or how these substances can work and really move one into an experience of a totally altered realm than what they're physically in.
That's what I want to talk about, is because we have heard these stories, and like yours, you mentioned, where it's not a blanket statement where you would say mushrooms are bad, don't do them because it's evil, right? Because people have had spiritual experience. Sometimes if you're on a low dose, it's just kind of a mellowing experience.
Right.
But what is the danger that mushrooms or DMT or whatever, psychedelics broadly, what's the danger that they could pose, and how does that work? I've heard you discuss where it's breaking down barriers of sorts in your mind. How does this work?
Yeah. So Orthodoxy has a term, it's a Russian term called prelest. And we
Right.
believe and that means spiritual delusion. And so the problem with these altered experiences is, how do you know what you experience is objectively true? And that's a hard one to actually put your finger on for somebody who goes into these altered states and say, okay, this was revealed to me and I know this. And you could say, well, how do you know that? Well, I experienced it when I was high on mushrooms. Well, but again, how do you know that that's the case? Well, I phenomenologically experienced it. So, in regards to the prelest, the sort of spiritual delusion these things can cause is like, a lot of people have the sense that we're all one and that they are then God. That like you said, it depends on the dosage. So I personally was very interested in the spiritual experience. So I was doing a whole, I would do 3.5 grams of mushrooms or more. Other people are interested in the low dose, the sort of minor stimulation where you get a little bit more energy. Maybe you have a little bit of tracers, the lights kind of sparkle and twinkle. And that's much more of a controllable state. So how much you take opens you up to this altered realm more and more and more. Some people describe these realms as very objective. So I did not. I tried to, but people like Terence McKenna talked about taking DMT and smoking DMT and moving into a sort of altered realm where they were sort of greeted by these, what he called these self-transforming machine elves or gnomes or leprechauns or elves or these small little tykes, and that they know all these things about you and they want to show you how how reality works. And often it relates to language, that language is the way that actually reality is based on. Now, this can get back to, again, the word, and that in the beginning was the word and the word was God. And so language is a really mystical dimension of our human experience that's really taken for granted. And language is the basis of magic itself. And so for Terence McKenna, he would describe these realms, and many people have smoked DMT since and say that they go into these same realms. The initial question, what was it? You're asking me.
How does, let's say, mushrooms, or what's the danger to doing something like that as far as altering the path you're headed on in life or something like that? I've heard of experiences where it's not just a trip in the moment and you come out of it. No, now I'm back to as I was. It can permanently alter some things, I believe.
Yeah, and it depends on your own psyche. Some people's psyches are more fragile than others. So, like you said, the dissolution of boundaries was a main feature of the sort of phenomenological experience that Terence McKenna described. And I actually believe, and I agree with him on this, that what psychedelics do is they dissolve cognitive boundaries, and the boundaries between you and another person, the boundaries between you and the tree outside, the boundaries between you and animals, the boundaries between you and the dead, that all these cognitive boundaries begin to be dissolved. And therefore, it's perceived that you can see reality as it truly is. Again, getting back to William Blake, Cleansing the Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley. And so these things can be dangerous because this dissolution of boundaries leads people to then often self-grandize them as divinity. Because once all these boundaries are dissolved, what's left is the self, what's left is your experience, and what's left is the realization that there is a spiritual reality. There's no doubt about the spiritual reality. And therefore, if I'm accessing this, I must be, and this is the general take, a sort of sentient apparatus of the universe. The universe is this abstraction, but the universe gains its personhood through me. And so I am the universe made man. This is the general belief in a lot of the psychedelic spirituality.
Yes.
And so it really self-grandizes the role of who we are. But at the same time, I don't want to say, because in Orthodox, we believe that we are the epitome of creation. The difference is we have to, through humility, submit to the will of God, and that there is an objective boundary here. Whereas you look at the psychedelic spirituality, who often promotes the use of drugs, you see orgiastic culture. So if you look at many of the cultures that do participate in inebriating substances, often it dissolves the boundaries between paternal lineage. So everybody will have a group orgy on the full moon. And so women get pregnant. Nobody really knows who the father is. And it's really not important because the collectivity raises the children. So it's a different structure of family. It's a different structure of the way society works. Again, these boundaries are dissolved. Often, it venerates a sort of female understanding of creation. We hear about Mother Gaia, stuff like that. And so these presuppositions, whereas when you look at these more what we would call the paternal or these patriarchal traditions, it actually begins to construct more and more boundaries, which is very different than the psychedelic spirituality, which dissolves these boundaries. Paternal lineage. So then within these patriarchal traditions, a man has a wife, and that way he assures that he knows who the children are and that they belong to him and that they're part of his progeny and his lineage. Rules, sexual morality, all these things get then substantiated in more of a patriarchal tradition. More and more and more boundaries are emerging. And that's where you can see this rhetoric of the suppression or the oppression due to patriarchal traditions, because they are establishing boundaries, and the patriarchal tradition or men themselves who belong and support these traditions maintain these boundaries. And so I would argue when we look at the contemporary culture and we look at transgenderism, and we look at the dissolution of national boundaries, we look at the dissolution between man and machine, transhumanism, that there's this natural presupposition that dissolving boundaries leads to a better outcome. It leads to a progressed reality.
Right.
And I would say this is actually a presupposition of many tribal cultures that participate in ritualistic psychedelic activity.
Yes, well put. And that there's so much in what you just said that I want to touch on, and I have a lot of it kind of written down. In the society, we kind of see, I would suspect you do, I do, societal decline around us. And a lot of what's considered a virtue these days is really what I think, and you think probably, it's the inversion of a real virtue, right? So Christ's energies, humility, love, and the opposite of those is being, so pride, right? The opposite of humility. We have a Pride Month. Pride is hey, be proud of everything you do. That's all about yourself. There's a narcissistic element to it that's really the inversion of Christ's energies. I think we can call that. So I wanted to head into the direction of Christ's energies, because this is outside of orthodoxy. You don't hear that discussed very often. And there is a little bit of a tie-in to the spirituality and the psychedelic mindset, where they just put vibes out there. You got a good energy, man. And there is a tie-in to that. And I think that is why you sometimes have the psychedelic to orthodoxy pipeline, because there are some similarities. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting how many people, and again, I'm kind of noted as the psychedelic to orthodox guy, but I have received so many messages of so many people that have basically had the same experience, that learning more and more and more, taking psychedelics eventually led them to realize why orthodoxy is so profound. And so, like we're talking about the boundaries and virtue versus Pride Month, again, it gets back to this concept of logos. So even for Plato and the Stoics and all this, there's an objective structure. And so there's then boundaries that we then have to be inside of. And so for the Stoics, again, pleasure was a way that would lead man astray. So you don't want to focus on pleasure. You want to focus on living a moral life within the boundaries of this logos. And so logos is, again, this metaphysical framework that we would say is where we get all these boundaries from. And so the goal then as the Christian is to submit to these boundaries by our free will choosing to abide by it. And we would believe that then we're sort of aligning ourselves with the will of God. Orthodoxy has this whole theology called the energy essence distinction. And this is unique in world religion. So no world religion has this same doctrine. And basically what the church fathers and what the church, the Orthodox Church, was trying to establish is a God that we do not put a limit on the essence of what it is. So throughout history, for example, the Neoplatonists, they would say God is pure unity. And if God's essence, so they're saying then the essence of God is pure unity, you could say, well, can God be multiple? And they say no. And so our God as Christians, the only thing we say about the essence is that it's one essence, three persons. And that plurality of the three persons maintains us to say God is oneness, one essence, but it's also multiple persons. Three for Pythagoras was the first number of multiplicity. And so then we would say our Christian God, there is no box we can put it in. When you have a monistic God, for example, how do you participate in God? This is a huge problem for a lot of world religions. Unfortunately, for the Thomistic forms of Catholicism, they believed in absolute divine simplicity, and therefore it was a sort of an analogy. We sort of, the love that you and I experience with our loved ones, our families, our wives, our children. This is an analogy for the love of God. Orthodoxy takes a totally different frame, and they say, no, actually, we participate directly with the Godhead through these uncreated energies. So through this energetic reality, and this is where psychedelics would say, yeah, the whole reality, you get into these altered experiences on psychedelics, and you feel like the only thing that's real is energy, and energy is all around us. Everything is energy, and it's different forms of energy, it's different degrees of energy. And orthodoxy actually makes the same claim. And it says the only thing that has a positive existence in the world is the energies of God. And this would include logic and reason and mercy and compassion and love and truth and language and so on and so forth. Everything that the good, all these things are energetic realities. They're not a thing. It's an energy. It's an activity. And if you participate in them, you have to do them. There is no such thing as like love that isn't acted out and participated. It's an energetic reality. And so Orthodoxy says this is how we engage directly with God. The more you actually love people, the more logical you are, the more compassionate you are, the more merciful you are. Actually, you're participating in these energies that pre-exist creation itself. They're not created. They're natural to the essence of what the Godhead is. And so we come to know the Godhead through these energies. We don't know the Godhead by describing what his essence is. We don't know the essence of God.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know the essence of me. And so let alone God. And so you and I have never met in person, but we've come to know each other through, again, energetic realities. Persons made in the image of God, according to Orthodox theology, come to know other persons through energy. So the way I move my hands, the way I talk, the way I speak, my tonation, these are all energies. And through energies, persons come to know other persons. And so the same thing is true for the three persons of the Godhead. We, being made in the image of God, come to know the three persons of the Godhead through these uncreated energies. And so, in a way, then, Orthodoxy has a whole theology for vibes and environments and going to places and being with people like, wow, I kind of catch his vibe. Something's off there. I went in there and it just felt weird. Orthodoxy is, that's exactly how the world works. And the opposite of these energies are not what we would say ontologically existent. They don't have a positive existence. So falsehood or death, life is another energy. The opposite of life is death. Death is a term to describe the absence of God's energy of life. And this is true for even contemporary physics. So the law of thermodynamics, like coldness. Cold is a term we use to describe the absence of thermodynamic heat. There is no such thing as cold. Cold is a linguistic term to describe a phenomenon of the absence of energy. And we would say, that is exactly how we relate to God. The only thing that exists are God's energies, and the opposite of these are just terms we use to describe the absence of. So when we talk about death and sin and falsehood or being illogical, being irrational, these are just terms to describe something that's happening that is absent of these energies. And we then believe the whole point of the spiritual warfare is to get us to dissipate these energies of God, the image of God, to not participate in this divine reality. So we slowly kill ourselves. And so Orthodoxy said, then we're choosing our salvation every moment, because as we choose to participate in these energies, I'm filled with these energies. If I were to die today in a car crash and I'm filled with the energies of God, how could I die? I'm filled with something that's uncreated. And because Christ in the incarnation, then he's already built this bridge through this energetic reality that now I don't die. I move into eternity. But if I'm a depraved person, I have a bunch of addictions and I'm a terrible, mean individual, and I have none of these energies whatsoever, when I die, it's not that God looks at a list like a bouncer and says, hey, bro, you're not on the list. I've already killed myself, and therefore my non-existence is my damnation.
Mm-hmm. And we can relate that, as we talked about months and months ago, to the NPC, but I don't even want to head down that direction yet, because talk about this also relates to theosis and divination, because other things that outside of Orthodoxy people don't hear often, but these energies and becoming full of them, for lack of a better phrase, is how we head in that direction. And then the saints who had these much better than you and I have, could actually perform miracles because they were headed to be more Christ-like. And that's another thing. A lot of people, it doesn't click. So can we connect those dots?
Yeah. So, and I am so far away from being any of these saints that would have different attributes, being able to heal people, being able to see into the future, being able to see people's sins. Saint Paisios was famous for people from all over the world coming to him on Mount Athos, and he would already know what they're struggling with. And this was due to a gift that God gives people who are filled with these energies because they're so close to God. And so a miracle is not the same thing as magic. And this is where a non-believer would say, oh yeah, well, it's just magic. Magic, in even a technical term, is the manifestation of one's own desire and will. A miracle, especially as Christians, we would say it's not magic, because a miracle only happens because God's wills it to happen. And so he can will miracles to happen through people who are so close to him because he's filled with these energies. And that's what these saints are. They are filled with compassion and mercy and love and truth and logic, and that therefore they are so much closer to the Godhead that God can work through them in the world so much better. And this is, again, it's a sort of it's an archetype of Christ, if you will. I don't mean to use that as again, a demeaning to the literal reality of Christ, but I'm meaning that obviously the Godhead worked through man as Jesus Christ, unifying those two natures. And then because of that, we can be filled with these energies, and God in a way can use us in the world, and we can perform miracles, and we can be given these clairvoyant gifts, if you will. But that's not something you can just do. And that's where, we look at Acts and we see somebody like Simon Magus, who later developed a Gnostic tradition, that there is a heresy within Orthodoxy called simony. And that's the idea that somebody can pay for the Holy Spirit, because that's what he wanted. He was a famous magician. And so he saw that the apostles were healing people and doing all these miracles. And he said, dang, I want some of that. How much you need so I can get baptized with the Holy Spirit? And they said, no, get out of here. Like, you're not allowed to receive this, because this is not something you purchase. This is something of the heart. You have to choose it. And then, then you can be brought into this sort of divine reality. And so there's a heresy called simony, that people can pay for their baptism. And unfortunately, this has made a resurgence within the Orthodox Church. And, I'll let people find out what jurisdictions this is occurring in, but there are jurisdictions here in the U.S. where you can pay so many hundreds of dollars and you can get baptized, here in a month or so. You don't have to go through the whole catechesis process. Oh. And this is a heresy that goes right back to the book of Acts with Simon Magus. And so we don't believe then that this is magic. This is not my will to heal somebody. I'm trying to accord myself with these energies of God so that God's will can work through me and then help other people. And that's a subtle distinction, but that's the main difference.
Mm-hmm. What's wrong? Discuss some of the problems with the psychedelic, we often say paradigm or worldview, because I don't want people to hear this and say, well, it sounds like the Orthodox Christian paradigm has a lot of similarities to the psychedelic paradigm, because while there are some, I want people to understand where we split ways as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of the main differences would be then divinization. How do we divinize ourselves? Within a magical worldview, and I would say certainly within forms of psychedelic spirituality, it's through magic, it's through the acquisition of power, it's through knowledge, it's through various things that you do, and you can then become more and more enlightened, if you will. We do not have that same term. Now, we believe in a sort of illumination. We actually use that language, illumination, but you're illuminated by submitting your will to God. So that means becoming, having a more of a chaste life. So if you're unmarried, not having sex, not engaging in inebriation all the time, not being prideful, not survival of the fittest and doing whatever you can do to get what you need in exclusion to other people. That we have to submit ourselves. And this comes to like a metaphor where, again, the ocean is lower than all the rivers. And we would say the ocean's the biggest body of water, but it's through humility in the sense of lowering oneself that actually you gain power. And this is the sort of mystery of Christ. This is the mystery that the Bible is trying to reveal. It's through humility to God, and it's through humility to each other that you actually become more like God. And that's why Christ was not a warrior. He was not a political figure, but that's what, of course, the Jews wanted. And so those who are characterized by the rejection of God, they're still looking for that. They're expecting a Messiah to return or come, who will be a political leader, who will be a military leader, who for us, we believe would be the Antichrist, because that's the opposite of what Christ is.
Yes.
And so the psychedelic worldview promotes, sexuality. It promotes, have, polygamous relationships, go to orgies, that all these experiences, the more experiences you have, the more empowered you are. And we would say, no, that's the opposite. The more experiences you have that are in opposition or outside the confines of this logos-oriented morality, these energies, that you're actually losing the image of God and you're becoming more and more dead.
Yes.
And that the goal of psychedelics then is to really annihilate the self, the concept of self, because the ego is perceived to be an illusion. And so the idea that I'm David Patrick Harry would be conceived of, that's an illusion. That's not a reality. And therefore, I need to, again, go on to these substances, have sexual experiences, maybe even, experience homosexual experiences and have all these experiences. And that would then make me realize that I'm much larger than this idea of David Patrick Harry. I'm a cosmic self. I'm the cosmic reality. I am God incarnate. And that is a major, what we consider a Luciferian worldview, where one illuminates oneself through these processes and realizes that they are God, where we are subtly participating in a different divinizing process through theosis, where we're trying to engage with these energies by living a moral life, that we then become divinized by the grace of God. God, through his grace, allows us to participate in that reality because we are not powerful.
Right.
But by submitting to him, we can become powerful in that sense, in that spiritual sense. So I would say sexual morality, the idea of self-divinization, the idea of objective morality, the idea of objective truth, metaphysical structures on how we relate to these things. These are major differences between these paradigms, even though there's so much overlap and similarities.
Yeah, that's well put. I've kept you almost an hour, and I don't want to keep you too much longer. Is there anything in closing that you'd still like to kind of not get off your chest, so to speak, but to get out to the folks and listeners of this show regarding psychedelics and orthodoxy that you haven't said?
Well, in regards to evil, one of the things that I've heard, and maybe I would take a little bit of umbrage with some of the other people within the Orthodox sphere that I've heard, is say that mushrooms are evil or these substances are evil. And from my understanding of theology, and again, I'm not a priest, so maybe they would know better than I am, evil requires a will and intention. And so I don't believe the mushroom is animate, even though Terence McKenna believed it to be. I don't believe the LSD is animate. I don't even believe the technology is animate, which again, my academic research focuses on transhumanism and stuff like that. Evil requires a will, and therefore what's evil about these substances is not the mushroom that's in your hand. It's that once you get into these altered states, you are engaging in a real reality of non-local entities, and they do have wills. Our theology of the demons is that a third of the angelic hierarchy was worshiping Lucifer, who wanted to be worshiped as God. And so Lucifer then falls into creation, as described in Luke, falls as a shooting star into who we call as Satan, the devil. Lucifer was the most beautiful, the most intelligent angel of God's creation. And this is why then what we would call a Luciferian form of spirituality is a sort of self-worship.
Yes.
And some spiritualities believe that, God only loves himself. And so if you have a monad, God, and you believe that all of creation is love and that it's all coming back to the Godhead, well, if there's only one God and there's not three persons as God, there is one God, right? One essence, three persons. But if you believe in a monistic God, God only loves himself. God's a very narcissistic being who only loves himself. And people will say, oh, that is the case. And therefore, the way that I become God is I just love myself.
Yes.
And I worship myself and I divinize myself and I manifest my desires. And by doing this, I'm going to make the world a better place because I'm acting more and more like the Godhead. And we would say that is a Luciferian paradigm. Whether you believe in Lucifer or not, regardless, we're just using the semiotic structure of the story of Lucifer to describe a sort of Promethean understanding, the guy who, Prometheus, who steals the light from the gods to bring it to humanity. Lucifer means, light bearer, light bringer. Right. And so it's the same archetype. Prometheus and Lucifer is the same archetypal understanding. And so these spiritualities, these Luciferian spiritualities, are really about self-worship.
Yes.
And we are not to worship ourselves. Our focus is to serve other people through humility and love. And so love is not something that's focused on my own will.
Right.
Love is focused on my will aligning to other people's will. And that's it's so subtle, but it's a totally different worldview.
Correct.
And it's a totally different way in which we relate to people. It's a totally different way in which we understand the role of our will.
Yes.
And once you see that, the life of Christ makes so much more sense of why that is so much more powerful, because you couldn't be more self-sacrificial. You couldn't try to serve more people. It's a limit, as Jordan Peterson says, and he's not exactly Christian, but it's a limit story. Jesus Christ, now again, it's more than a story, but using that understanding, you couldn't describe a figure that is, again, that reaches the limits of compassion and humility and justice. It is a limit story. And so these Luciferian worldviews, this has to do with again, and that's why Pride Month, as a Christian, we say it's so apropos, because what they are worshiping is themselves. They're going against the natural order of the world by, castrating themselves or castrating their children, cutting. I saw a young girl that she was like 12 years old and she already had a top surgery where the parents allowed her breast to be cut off. We would say this is a mutilation, and this is exactly what sin does. A sin is the mutilation of your soul.
Yes.
And we're seeing by people transgressing this objective boundary, they're literally mutilating themselves. It's just so much more obvious now that the sin, we can actually see it on their body. We can see it in their face. You can see it in the angriness that they have towards the world.
Yes.
That they've already mutilated themselves on the inside by adopting lies. And that's why Christ is the truth. Truth is a who, not a what. As we bring him into our lives, we can see clearly. That's why he heals the blind. I mean, the story about the blind man who didn't even have eyeballs, when Christ spit in the dirt and rubbed it in his eyes and gave him eyeballs, that's what Christ does to all of us. We're all born blind. And as we relate to him more and more and pray and commune and go to church and participate in these energies, we can see more and more and more of the world. And unfortunately, the people who choose the opposite, their noetic faculties are darkened more and more and more and more. And so they then can't see it. The only thing that they can see is themselves. And that's honestly, again, as a Christian perspective, we would say that's why they hate the world, because really they hate themselves and they only serve themselves.
Yeah, and you see so much of that on social media, and there's a blending or a misconception or a perversion of an actual Christ-like love. And it's such a self-worship while they're putting out messaging of like, I love everyone, just here's me. There's so much self-worship on social media, and it's hard to keep seeing. And sometimes as I feel it's like the anger that starts to sit within me as I see it, I have to stop, turn it off, look somewhere else, because it's almost like that's what it's meant to induce.
Right. And that's what evil's trying to do, is trying to get us to become more like them. And that's why, again, Christ even loved the people that killed him, loved the people who reject. And that's the difference. And that's what we call a loving person is, if you only loved your wife and your kids and you hated everybody else, could you be characterized as a loving person?
Right.
No. Even though, you love your wife and you love your children, you'll do anything for them, but then you hate everybody else in the world. That's not love. Love includes loving people, whether they love you back or not.
Yes.
And that's the reality of Christ. And that's the reality of the one in the many too, that this one in the many, whether we begin our philosophy with looking at the particulars of the many, or we begin with the one universal categories, that the way all this stuff is reconciled is through love. It's reconciled in the Godhead through love. It's reconciled in us through love, that we have to love people whether they love us or not. And that then opens the possibility of everything to be reunited and brought back together, and maintains the individuality, maintains its particularness, but then is brought back into a unity through love. And that is an energy, and that is a reality. And that's then what we're called to do. And that's what Christ showed us, that this is how you conquer the world. That if you truly love and you truly love truth, which is him, and you pursue truth, the world's going to persecute you. And we see that now more than ever, that if you start diving into the rabbit holes and the conspiracy theories, and you start connecting dots and you see what's going on in the world, I'm telling you, the world's going to persecute you, because Christ showed us this is the structure of this world. Lucifer was given dominion of earth before he fell. He fell then as Satan, as the devil. He still has dominion of this realm. Now, Christ has already defeated death, the category that, again, he was in control of. That's this icon right here. That you see the doors of Hades shaped as a cross, Christ pulling Adam and Eve out of the grave, all the shackles of death, the locks, the keys, they're all broken. They're all broken in Christ. And he then defeated death as a category itself. He bound Satan for 1,000 years, and then he's been loose. And so, Satan has been loose on the world, and he's very active right now. And the whole goal of his is he already knows how all this stuff ends. He sinned, all those angels that fell, they sinned inside of eternity. There's no going back for them. And so they know that the only thing that's happening in time is us. We're within space and time. They're outside space and time, but they get to enter through us. Yeah. And the goal is God going to work through us, or the demon's going to work through us? And it's all about taking us to the same place that they're going. And Christ is trying to take us to the same place that he's at. And that's the whole spiritual reality.
That is the spiritual warfare. Well put, David Patrick Harry. Man, that was good. There's so many, when I want to break down clips at some points for certain episodes. With yours, it could be just clip after clip after clip. So thank you for being here.
No problem, brother.
Time to plug anything you'd like, anything you got coming up.
Yeah. If you enjoy this stream or any of these topics, go to my YouTube channel, Church of the Eternal Logos, and subscribe. Again, it's not a real church. This is I've got people that send me angry messages that claim I'm leading people astray. This is not a church. It's just an analogy. It's just I talk about worldly topics from the perspective of Logos, from the perspective of Logos theology. And so it's the Church of the Eternal Logos, just because I'm trying to lead people to Christ. I'm Orthodox. I'm not a priest. So I belong to the Orthodox Church. Go there if you want to go to the real church. But if you would like to hear more of these ideas, I stream regularly over there. I have tons of videos on tons of different topics. And then if you would like to reach out, you can go to my website, davidpatrickharry.com or churchoftheeternallogos.com. Take you to the exact same place. And I do one-on-ones if people want to talk about religious studies. Again, most of my academic stuff is not about orthodoxy, actually. It's about world religions, about Eastern mysticism, Gnosticism, psychedelics, and then, of course, transhumanism and technology. If you'd be interested in talking about any of those topics, you can sign up for one-on-one sessions. If you'd like to support my work, the best way you can support my work is just by going to my website and becoming a website member. Just $5 a month, but that's the best way you could help me out. And so if anybody would like to do that, feel free to. I'd be greatly appreciative.
Yes, and I do that, $5 a month. So I recommend to all my listeners that you guys do as well. I think it's obvious you're supporting a good man and a good project for sure. And I will say this too, there's not too many people, at least who, when I watch their streams and their work and their content, that put in, I can tell and I know you put in a lot of effort and work and research into every stream you do. And maybe I can tell that just because I do this similar thing, and the little bit of work I put into this is very time consuming, and yours is on a whole other level. You and Jay Dyer and people like that the work is nuts. And so kudos to you guys for doing such great stuff.
Thank you, brother. I do appreciate that. And thanks for the support, man. I truly do appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. David Patrick Harry, thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you, brother. God bless.
You too. What a great discussion with David Patrick Harry. I hope y'all learned something. I know you did. Next week, another heavy hitter coming in. Let's see, can I give you a hint? He does great live streams on YouTube, quite often, I should say. I don't think it's daily, but it's a lot. Very smart, and you love his comic renderings, let's say. I think that's almost too obvious, but my guest next week, another heavy hitter, a very good one. And until then, I will see you guys. Have a good one.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast, our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.